welcome, Book Stew viewers and listeners. Today I have an author with me who's written a book, and I confirmed with him before today's episode starts that there was not another fictional book written about this topic that he could find anyway, and he's a literature professor, so he should know. So I want to welcome Ted Delaney and his novel, Hard Margins. I'm going to just give a little of Ted's background. He is the founding editor of the Mount Hope Literary Magazine of Roger Williams University in Rhode Island, and he's also a professor of creative writing and has been there for 35 years, so that's quite the tenure. So welcome, Ted.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, Ted, why this story? This focuses on two men who worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs 100 years apart post two wars. So please give us a little background on your decision to tell this story, or these two stories.
Absolutely. And I guess I should start by telling you a little background on my own journey, because that's very much, tied into that. So I've been at Roger Williams for 35 years. I came there after a number of years as a journalist. So even though I'm from Fall River, Massachusetts, I spent a good part of my career out in Colorado before I came back east. And during the time that I was a journalist there, I did a good bit of reporting on the woes and sometimes triumphs of a number of the major tribes in Colorado, Wyoming, Arizona, etc. And so I did a lot of hands-on. Now, in this book, it focuses on a tribe which is both fictional and a composite, but it goes toward the things that I saw writing as a journalist in terms of the sort of the way that Native American people were treated, the way the reservations functioned. But I became most interested in these Bureau of Indian Affairs agents. And in particular, it was the fact that they are go-betweens. They're kind of between these two worlds of the bureaucracy, of the white culture, of the government, et cetera, and in some ways are meant to be looking out for the best interests of the tribes. But by the same token, the tribes, at least in those years, really looked at them as people who were, essentially inflicting a lot of pain and suffering on them. And so the book is two parts, and it focuses on one BIA agent in 1957 and another in the 1870s. It's much more of a kind of a spread of years there. And their part in how the tribe got to where they were at, got to this kind of difficult place. In my reporting, I was writing at the time for the Chicago Tribune magazine. Even though I was living in Colorado, I wrote for the Tribune. And I went up to a Wind River reservation up in Wyoming. And the reason I was up there was because they had a series of teen suicides, and it was national news at the time. It was a big story, but spent a lot of time there and went back a good many times to learn more about the story. And in that, learned a lot of history. And that's where the kind of early days of that tribe's history came from.
So I did, of course, Google the tribe and saw that there were tribes with similar names, but what was the real tribe, and why did you not use the real tribe?
So there were two really primary tribes that are composited. One was the Northern Arapaho tribe. They're up in Wind River, which is a stretch of fairly barren land going up. It's the one reservation has Northern Arapaho at one end and Shoshone at the other end. And that was where the teen suicides were. But I also spent a good bit of time in the Four Corners area, southwestern Colorado, where the tribe there were the Ute Mountain Utes. And the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, they were having a different set of problems, and a lot of their problems had to do with water. Whereas the Northern Arapaho tribe, their issues were that they had lived, as you hear this story a lot in a number of tribes, they had been given these reservations because the land was virtually unusable by settlers. And then it turns out there were tremendous amounts of oil and gas deposited there. And with the sudden value of the land, suddenly, in comes, the various people who were going to try to take that away. And so in this composite tribe, it kind of combines a lot of those issues they were going through into one piece.
How did they feel about speaking with you, especially since you weren't even reporting locally, you were reporting to Chicago?
Yeah, yeah. And I wrote for the Denver Post about them, and I wrote so it was a series of stories throughout different places I had written for. But at the time, they were very open and welcoming. It was part of what was going on, I think, in a lot of ways. For instance, with the teen suicide stories, were both that sense of incursion that reporters are showing up to write the story, but on the other side of it was the desire to tell their story and to talk about why they were going through the difficulties they were going through. And I actually did a story that the piece I did in the Tribune was a lengthy story, and it focused on, of all things, the tribe's absolute love of basketball. And so that focus, it seems kind of light and but it really went toward the notion that every aspect of their own culture had been basically stripped from them forcibly. And so it became kind of a metaphor, for what they were doing. So I kept that in mind, those stories I wrote. And I always knew I was going to try to write something about it. But at the time I was doing the stories, I hadn't even attempted writing fiction yet. I only began writing fiction much later. And it took me some time to learn how to do that. So it was quite a while later I began to write this book.
And did you go back to your original writings before you started? And what other source materials did you have? I thought, let me ask that, and then I'll ask you about the order that the story is presented in. There's two stories.
Yes. Yeah, well, I had tons of notes, and again, that's one thing about the old way of doing things is you never throw out your notebooks, right? And they're all in a big, file drawer in my office. But a lot of it originally became interesting because when I was in Denver, they have the Denver Museum has this tremendous Western history collection at the library. And it was just this great research facility. And I remember at the time my editor said, okay, I'll give you a full day to go over there and read up on this tribe. And of course, one day was just this tiny, tiny dose of what I wanted to know. One of the things that is wonderful these days when you're writing any kind of historical fiction are things like JSTOR, where you can go on and just pull all this research that you would not have been able to access unless you were there in person. But I remember back in Colorado back then, just going through all the microfiche and reading stories and being kind of both amazed and intrigued and piecing it all together. And a lot of history books. I mean, one of the big documents of all things that I read was a National Geological Survey reports, because so much of what the tribes have gone through have to do with the environment,
rights, yep.
They were forced into. It changes how you can live.
So the order was kind of the reverse of what you would expect. It's not chronological. So it's actually divided into two books. And the first book takes place in 1958 with a Korean War veteran who becomes a Bureau of Indian Affairs employee. His name is Tim Hubbard, and he is responsible for the distribution of oil money to the tribes. And then book 2 deals with a Civil War veteran who is also distributing to the tribes, but he's distributing food. So he especially, but you started with the modern story first. Why was that?
I thought that the architecture of the book made sense to start with essentially the more modern day reality and then fill it out by going back to how this all began, what the beginning of it all was. Now, I will say that that goes toward another part of the historical thing. So in historical fiction, as you well know, you can do a really direct correlation. You know, you can use the real names and the real people and the real events, or you can let an event inspire what you're writing about. And one of the events that inspired a lot of this was the so-called Meeker Massacre. And that was the Utes who were at that time, they were called the White River Utes. This was in the 1870s. And the agent there was named Nathan Meeker. And so Dorrance is a very loose adaptation of the Meeker story. Meeker worked for Horace Greeley originally as a journalist. He was a Civil War veteran. And in the end, he pushed the tribe too hard in trying to convert them from being horsemen and hunters, which the government frowned upon because that meant they had to range across other properties, if you will, and turn them into farmers, which the tribe absolutely rejected as not who they are, what they do, etc. And at that time, there was a rebellion and a dozen people were killed. And that was the effective end of the Ute tribe as it existed. And the Ute Mountain Utes and the Southern Utes, a different tribe nearby, they were sort of the remnants of what happened there. So with the Dorrance story, it's much more historically accurate or, historically inspired. With the Hubbard story, the 1958 story, it's more about reaching a point where there seems no way out. And I think, in the years, 40 years since I wrote the stories, and beyond, much has changed. So I don't think that the 1958 or even the late 1980s stories I wrote would be accurate replications of what's happening now, but it was how it was, and things had gotten really bad.
Can you describe those changes? Because, it's funny because you read something, I was born in 52. You read something said in 1958, and in your head, it's kind of modern until you realize how long ago, which I don't want to think about, 1958 was.
Right. Well, that's with some of my writing colleagues, we joke that if I was alive when this happened, is that even historical fiction or is that just like, the life I lived? So that is something. But in the mid 50s, there were two big things that happened with the tribes and particularly with the Northern Arapaho. One was the oil, right? It had been discovered. It was known earlier than that, but there became this really kind of concerted effort by the government to come in and exploit that. And as you might imagine, the tribes themselves got a tiny, tiny cut of what was available to be had there. There's the now I remember the movie Flower Moon, the Scorsese movie deals with that. It was in Oklahoma, but the same difference, that suddenly this worthless land was worth something. But the second part of it, which wasn't completely separate from the first part of it, was the so-called Indian Relocation Act, in which the government, this was, Eisenhower and thereabouts, what they wanted to essentially do was clear the reservations and quote unquote assimilate tribal members into white society. They didn't do it in a way that was particularly beneficial. They would give a young person a bus ticket to some large city and give them $200 and no return ticket if they change their mind. But it was an effort with other efforts, including before that by the Catholic Church, to sort of force the culture out of the tribes, and so this is where you get into the whole thing about the church and what may have been well-meaning efforts to stop them from knowing their native language, to get off the reservation and do other things. But the kind of story tension there, if you will, is that if you were on the reservation, you had some income based on the oil proceeds. And if you left the reservation, you gave those up forever. And if you left and found it wasn't working out, there was really no return to be had. And so that was what I wanted to write about to some degree. And so Hubbard, our agent, he's a bureaucrat in the middle of this, but he's also got his own human story of virtually the same thing of, do I leave? Do I stay? Do I endure? Are there other things I should seek? And I'm not going to suggest that he is an analog to the tribes, but I think it's part of the human journey.
Well, and each man has kind of someone who's kind of on his side. It's Captain Brantley in 1873, and it's a Native American named Jim for Hubbard, and they also have wives.
Yeah.
And so I thought that those secondary characters were very important. So did you start with the initial two men and then work out from there?
Almost all of the characters are at least very loosely based on, in book one, are very much based on people I met and engaged with when I was doing this journalism years ago. And so, yeah, there's Jimmy, who's a young guy who's sort of torn between where he wants to be in the world. There's Sam, who's another war veteran who has sort of eschewed white society and is almost returned to kind of like a back to the land kind of living away from, he doesn't want to take the oil money. He's found his little spot. And these were based on people I met out on the reservations who were going through this. And so, and again, with the book too, with Dorrance, to kind of follow the theme here, is he is in his own way an analog to the tribe at that time, which is being forced into something they don't really want to do. But in order for him to escape the fate he doesn't want, he has to get them to accept the fate they don't want.
But the Dorrance story, I got to interrupt you there because I don't want to leave out the Horace Greeley and the New Sunrise. Horace Greeley, of the alleged Go West young man, which I guess nobody ever found that real quote, actually funded Dorrance and his wife to build a collective farm to the tune of $1,000, which of course was a lot of money then, and to sell shares to other people. They put an ad in the paper, in Greeley's papers in New York, and 1,000 people showed up to do this, and then they found out that a share was $500 or $250. They couldn't come up with the money, but families did, and they actually all went out together to try to set up farms, and it failed miserably. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. And of course, that was a time, 1840s, 50s, 60s, where there was a sort of idealism, things like Fourierism and Brook Farm and all of these sort of utopian communities based around agriculture. And again, in the facts of history, Nathan Meeker was funded by Horace Greeley to create this idealistic community. The difference is that in real life, they picked a pretty good spot to do it, and it succeeded. And that town is now Greeley, Colorado, named after Horace Greeley. But it in the book, it really follows more of the sort of direction that some of these earlier utopian communities, like the Phalanx and all these took, which is that often idealists are not well prepared for the reality they face. And so, the great example was always Brook Farm, where they all, none of them actually like farming. They like sitting around and philosophizing about how, farming is good for the soul. And they weren't really, and they picked a bad piece of land and everything else, and they failed. This was sort of in the middle, with the idea being that in some ways they were failing at the very same things they were demanding that the tribes
Yep.
succeed in.
I thought that was a very touching episode for Dorrance, because he tried so hard, and really his wife was the driving force behind that. So that was tragic. We're running out of time, but I have one more question for you, and that's about the white people who lived around the reservations or where the Indians lived. To a person, they were racist, horrible, violent. Do you think that comes from maybe their families' experience with Native Americans, when there were actual wars going on? That was surprising to me, that there was, all they wanted to do was get rid of the Indians, and it wasn't for their financial gain particularly. It was just because they hated them.
Yeah, it's very real, and it was, and it is. My experiences, and again, I'm from Massachusetts originally, and ended up, and that was one thing about being a journalist out west. Everything was new and interesting to me in that respect of seeing a different culture, meaning different cultures of our own country. But to me, the kind of racism was over the top, and not just in Wyoming. It was down in Colorado, Arizona. Part of that is that the tribes were seen as nuisances. Part of it was that there was this tremendous resentment to the fact they were getting quote unquote free money, to coin a term you hear these days to try to diminish people. The idea, why are they being given handouts while I'm over here working at a feedlot, for nothing. And so in my time, and again, this was in the 80s, mid to late 80s, when I was originally reporting this, I was kind of shocked by the open racism that went on. And I don't think it's changed much from what I see politically. I mean, I don't go out there that much anymore. And I certainly, don't travel to little town. I mean, in those days, I traveled to so many little towns in Colorado doing stories. And, the racism was pretty casual. And I think part of it maybe has to do with just the other. The idea that these are people different than me, therefore they must be inferior, or, why, if they don't think the way I do, there must be something wrong with them. You get into that whole kind of reality of human nature there.
But I guess when you think of, here we are in Massachusetts, right? And we certainly did our share of making life miserable for Native Americans. But now we do land declarations. There are, I belong to Historic New England, and they all year long, they run really great programs about Indians in New England that are just fascinating to me.
Right.
So I think here we have, and I don't know why it would be so different than out west, maybe because we don't pay tribes like they do. We don't have oil rights. But there are casinos, so I think, people probably resent that. But that was really shocking in the book, and I thought you portrayed it really, really well. Well, we are out of time, but I just want to include two quick quotes, just to kind of give the tone of some more tone to the book. So this was in a Horace Greeley description, and it said, "Agriculture had become to Greeley the shining answer to the gloom of armed conflict." I thought that was a pretty amazing observation. So I won't, we don't have time for me to go into great depth about how you wrote that sentence, but it's a great sentence. And
Well, I
another,
guess people will just have to read the book.
well, they should read it anyway. The other one was about the failure of, of New Sunrise. And the wife said, we sought a perfect family. So that was, letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. But that was kind of heart-wrenching because the intentions were all great and the outcome was so not great. So I want to thank you so much for being on Book Stew. I want to recommend this book very heartily because as we've been talking about it, I've been thinking more and more about what I liked about it and how the contrast between the two time frames and the two stories, and telling the story from the vantage of the Indian agents who, who were probably despised by white people and despised by Indians. So I think you represent their point of view, I imagine, really, really well. A hard job, not a job that anyone would really want to have, being in the middle like that. So thanks so much for being on Book Stew. And viewers and listeners, I really want to recommend Hard Margins. Quick question, where does the title come from?
Just trying to come up with a way of describing what the reality was of these, these borders that keep people apart and how they are kept very strict.
Well, hard is definitely right. So thanks again for being on Book Stew, and viewers and listeners, Hard Margins by it's not Ted in the author's name, it's Edward, but Ted Delaney, thanks again for joining me today.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.